Welcome, everyone. Can you hear us? Okay. So I would like to welcome you all to this panel, which is in support of the very poetically titled exhibition, Locating the Little Heartbeats. And we're going to learn a little bit about that exhibition and about Julie Nagam's process today. And I'm going to formally introduce you to everybody. But there's just a few things. One thing that really excited me about Julie's art is that she uses an animation technique to remind us that nature is animated, or vital and alive. So she brings her formal elements to show us, to tell us a story. And I think if we start to think about nature as vital, it actually reintroduces us to a very different way of looking at things, a much more holistic worldview where humanity is part of nature. And I think that's one of the themes today. I think everybody here will be able to speak to that. So I'm going to introduce you formally to everybody at the table. And there's, I think, two parallel streams of knowledge or two sets of experiences at the table today. And the first one, and I actually have some images. I'm going to go up here. So the first one is, I want to introduce you to Carl Smith. And I think I learned from Carl Smith a little bit that for some Indigenous people, they are stewards of the land. But this is actually really a reciprocal relationship because they guard the land, but the land also gives back to them. And you can learn all kinds of practical things from the land, but also maybe philosophical and even spiritual things. And I know this because I've gone up now to the Brokenhead Wetland Interpretive Trail twice, and Carl has led us around, and he knows so much about the plants up there. And for those of you who don't know it, it's an incredible experience. Actually, Julie and I have gone up with our department, we've gone up with students, our families, and it's on Highway 59, just as part of the Brokenhead Ojibwe Nation. And Carl was one of the key people organizing that. So we'll come back to everyone to speak, but I just wanted to introduce you with some pictures. Next is my friend and colleague and a curator and an artist and a professor, and you can see the title here. She's Chair of History of Indigenous Arts of North America and a professor in art history at the University of Winnipeg. Julie, I hope today is going to tell us a little bit about her process, about how she chose the plants that she did, and I'm sure all of them are at Brokenhead. I'm sure that you saw some of them there. And also, I often explain Julie's art by using the term land-based, but the other day at the opening, she said plant-based knowledge. So I would like to hear that. Julie? Just warning you. Dr. Niigaan Sinclair, who's Associate Professor of Native Studies at the University of Manitoba. Dr. Sinclair wrote the essay for Julie's catalog, and it's a really, really interesting essay, I think, also about connectivity, about people tied to their territory and their area, and what colonization did to the people in this area, and how, maybe, and again, you can correct me, but are there different ways of looking at nature that might be an anecdote to our typical Western values that tend to be based around greed? I'll just say it like that. And then finally, my other colleague, Dr. Delia Gavrus, who also works in the history department with me and who's a Chancellor's research chair right now. And Delia is a historian of science and medicine, and she specializes in how we understand the human mind. These things change over time, and that has brought her to notions of consciousness. And we've been talking about plant consciousness. So this is actually an old and a new idea. If you go back in history, there's lots of interest in plant consciousness, and she has some slides to show us that. But she's particularly looking at new biological theories that discuss plants as conscious, and then I'll say alive and vital, and that links directly with Julie's show, because in Julie's show, the plants are all alive. And I'm Dr. Serena Keshavjee. I also teach in the history department. And like Delia, my experience is more about Western environmentalism. And I look actually at Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment right into the 19th century, especially how artists dealt with environmental theories. And you might not know this, but environmentalism actually goes back a long way. In fact, if there are other scholars in the room, they can probably give me examples of vitalism and holism right even in the Greco-Roman period. But I look at the pushback that happened around industrialization, and in particular, the interest as biology was developing, and really important, and this is evolutionary theory. Because if you think about it, evolutionary theory says we are part of nature. We developed from nature. And the two images I have up here, one is from 1905, and if you see that, that is actually a man on the moon looking at the Earth, and that's from 1905, and it was an anarchist geographer who got the artist to do that. And I compare it to the 1972 very famous Apollo images from 1972, which are always described as kind of kickstarting the modern environmentalist movement. When we saw this little blue planet in this vast universe, you can't help but feel humble, and it decenters humanity for sure. But I wanted to show you that there are really older examples of that kind of attitude, even before people had ever gone to the moon. So I'm going to throw out some questions for the group, and the first question we thought of was maybe how did you come to being interested in plants, and that can be a personal answer if you want. And are there any current projects that we should know about that are around plants? So I'm going to throw that one out. We have a few more, but we'll start with that one.
You guys just want to go in order? Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to have such a lovely and large crowd here on a blistery kind of cold day when yesterday was just so beautiful. I want to say Chimegwich and Marcy to everybody that's brought their good hearts and good minds here today. I'm also really thrilled to be on this amazing panel with some really incredible people who I feel like might be able to talk about my work even better than me, but we'll see. For me, I think the concept of a lot of my work comes out of plants, but also land-based. I would still use land-based and plant-based. I think a lot about, where I was from, what kind of connections I had to the land. For me, I have lived different periods away from home, and so I know that whenever I get the opportunity to come back to home, I'm always connected in terms of to the land as opposed to a physical building or place. So even though actually my parents still live in my childhood home, homes tend to shift and change and get renovated, and my parents' one always seems to be under construction, and if they ever hear this, they'll probably laugh, but it's true. So it's always kind of constantly shifting and changing, and the land also shifts and changes, but there's also these kind of beautiful and poetic markers that I see, and so for me, it's specific kind of trees. So I grew up just close to Birds Hill Park, so that kind of area. And so for me, that kind of aspen, parkland, prairie feeling is such an amazing kind of connection, and it kind of moves me to want to be there. Also, too, my mom tells me since I was a little kid, I used to, I actually created my own garden on my own. My parents actually didn't garden, and they would laugh at me when I'd go out there to do that kind of work. And, but, they never laughed at the end when we actually got to eat all the carrots and the peas and, the corn and whatever else I grew. And so I think for me, there's been always a kind of intuitive connection in terms of thinking about the importance of those kind of small little living beings that provide us with so many opportunities, and they also give us hope, they give us health, they connect us and ground us. And so whenever I'm feeling tired or stressed out, which I'm sure most of you are in January, I always feel grounded and reconnected as soon as I get to be quietly outside. And so, I lived for a long time in Toronto, which I know probably won't be exciting to you guys, but the part about Toronto that was so interesting is I know that it kind of is a concrete jungle, and you see skyscrapers everywhere, and there's always a kind of a critique that there's a lack of nature. But every time I'd walk around that city, you would see little tiny plants starting to push themselves up and through the concrete, and they would make sure that they always had a presence. And so even moments where I'd feel, overwhelmed or like missing home, I would go for a walk in High Park, or I'd go for a walk in Queen's Park, or Trinity Bell Woods is actually one of my favorites. And so I would just find myself sitting around nature so that I could remember, where I was grounded and where I was from. And even though I was a little bit homesick, I could connect that way. I'd say this project that you guys get to see at the University of Winnipeg is my current project, and I do hope that you get the opportunity to go see the exhibition. I'm going to talk a little bit more, I think, about the process, but the other project that I'm going to talk about is I'm working on a really large-scale multimedia installation with a Maori artist from New Zealand who also has a really significant river from his community, and his river was actually granted personhood, so it's actually considered a living entity. And so the two of us are actually going to collaborate on this kind of large-scale work where we're going to have the two rivers that where I'm from connect and meet his river, and we're going to look at sort of Métis flower-based patterns and then match them or try and interweave them into Maori patterns and see how that kind of flora and fauna kind of moves together, and it'll be kind of a large-scale animation. And so we're looking at that project. I think we just started in November, and the goal would be to have it kind of ready by the fall. So that's, I guess, one of my new projects.
So just one of the things to think about with Julie is always this combination of rooted in nature, but using new digital technology. So that seems like they might be in conflict, but they're not, actually. You bring them together.
I think in terms of like, there's this misconception that media is new. And in actuality, I mean, I really love some of the words that, mentor and friend Cheryl Arundel talks about, that we've always been innovative, we've always used media, and we've always, so this kind of idea of that, new media is new, it's actually not new, it's quite old. And so the way that we innovate and think about media has always been something that we've constantly been doing. So, I really like the combination of thinking about kind of using different kinds of techniques to get to a different result. And I like the tension between nature and technology. So,
what was the question again?
I want you to, so tell us maybe a little bit about how you got to help design the Brokenhead Interpretive Trail, where you learned your knowledge from, and are there any projects in the future that you're working on? I'm going to put those pictures back up that I have of the trail.
Good afternoon. Welcome to 3D1, home of our Ojibwe people and some of the Cree in the areas, and home in Métis. And I started with hanging out with the elders, listening to them speak. I lived in the city for a lot of years and worked in the city, and then I went back to the community. It just changed the pace, and then I ended up staying there. And I started working with my father. He was a plant man. He did medicines, and then eventually I met his group of elders from Saugeen, Little Black, and Hollow Water. And they talked about education quite a bit, on how do we educate the public on First Nations initiatives and what we have planned, what we're going to do. And so they talked about the trail. And so we worked on the trail. We did an inventory on all the plants, trees, and everything, and the bugs, insects, and stuff. So we worked on that. We set up a group, and we called it the Wendin. It's Ojibwe for trust. So we put it in ourselves that we trust ourselves to take care of this land, the area of the wetlands. It's over 1,200 hectares. It's protected, and it's an ecological reserve. And it took 15 years to get it open, and a lot of fundraising, and provincial government finally came up with some funds to develop the trail system and build it. And during that time, I met Julie, and and we worked on a few projects. I did some tours with her and her group and her family, and but it was the elders that actually wanted this trail opened, and our committee worked with the elders, and we had a partnership with the Manitoba Mall Forest, Native Orchid Conservation, East Side Aboriginal Sustainable Tourism, and the province of Manitoba. So that was our partnership, and we all started working. And then we got an endowment fund from the from Winnipeg Foundation. So that's going to be a endowment fund for every year. There's going to be maintenance dollars, upkeep dollars. So it's not going to fall on the wayside and not be looked after or maintained. But we have a core funding for maintenance now and stuff. So we're not lacking that. So, but we have the interpretation of us from the elders again. So we developed the interpretation on what they decided was what we should educate the people that come through, the general public. And for the last 2 years, we must have had about over 3,000 people come through. Last year was the biggest year, it was over 1,400, because we have a trail counter, so we know how many people come and go. And it's very interesting, and like I say, it was the elders that actually wanted us to do this, so we just carried on. To this day, there's only one elder left out of that group, so it was very hard on him because he's the last one, and he really enjoys the trail. And I enjoy it. It's part of my life now. I've been there for forever, and I don't see myself leaving there. I think I'll be there for a long time. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much, Serena, for the introduction, and thank you, Julie, so much for inviting me to be part of this. For those of you who've seen it, Julie's beautiful and moving. Oh, sorry. Can you hear me better now? Exhibit is about locating the little hearts, and I'll say a few words today about perhaps locating their little minds, the plant's little minds. Maybe a future project, Julie. So I write about the history of neuroscience. So I've been interested in for a long time in how scientists, how doctors conceptualize the mind, conceptualize consciousness. And I'm particularly interested in Wilder Penfield, the Canadian neurosurgeon. He had a very interesting dualist model of the mind. He thought the mind was a different entity, not just a functioning brain. So this is where my interest lies. And so while thinking about this, for the past few years, I became aware that some contemporary plant scientists were articulating ideas about plants that involved words like cognition, information processing, intelligence, learning, memory, communication, intent, choice, motivation, consciousness, and personhood. So I should pause here to say, on a personal level, as you saw in Serena's picture, I love plants. I've always surrounded myself with potted plants wherever I lived in the world. But on a scholarly front, I knew very little about plants. I still know very little about plants. I know very little about the history of botany. It's not my area of expertise, so I just want to be clear about that. I'm not an expert on this, but I've become very interested, because of my interest in minds, in some of this recent shift. So having said that, I want to explore 3 points here, and make 3 points. One, that there seems to be, and certainly some scientists are arguing, that there is a paradigm shift that is taking place in botany, ecology, and other related scientific fields. And like all paradigm shifts, there's there's resistance to this, there's pushback from the establishment, and I think it remains to be seen whether it's an enduring phenomenon, this paradigm shift. We're in the middle of it, so it'll be interesting to see what happens. Secondly, I want to say that some of the scientists involved in this paradigm shift specifically credit Indigenous knowledge for this change in their thinking and in their work. And thirdly, as Serena has already pointed out, there is a long history, not only in Indigenous knowledge traditions, but in also what we might call, quote unquote, Western science, about a longer tradition of talking about plant consciousness. I think that's perfect. These are some articles I pulled out that show around 1908 the work of the botanist Francis Darwin, who was Charles Darwin's son, who came up with a theory of consciousness in trees and plants, and was criticized by the other botanists. It wasn't a very popular theory within those scientific circles, and these ideas are certainly go back several years before that as well. So just very briefly, two of the scientists who are part of this shift are Monica Galliano and Suzanne Simard. Thanks so much, Serena. And I just want to give a quote. It's something that Monica Galliano said about her plans for this new science, this new paradigm shift. She says, quote, "I plan to set up a new lab exploring all forms of BI, biological intelligence, as opposed to AI. And part of my vision, and not a minor part, is to develop an integrated eco-cultural approach guided by different disciplinary perspectives, including Indigenous knowledge, where nature, and specifically plants, can be examined as a very healthy and successful model to reimagine human society," end quote. That's what she says. And this is important, the way we think about plants, the way we engage with nature is important because this has a real consequence in how we treat nature, as historians of science, feminist historians of science have been arguing for decades now. So I can give more examples, I can talk about their work in more detail perhaps later, but I think I'll stop here.
Okay. So bonjour. Bonjour Ganasitak, miigwech sema gibagajinan. Thank you for your tobacco, for talking for today, and also for being on this panel. So miigwech Julie for asking me to write the essay for this, which was an absolute honor and a pleasure for the most part, because I've worked with Julie for a long time, but being able to participate within her work and a sort of a semblance of her work was really exciting to watch. I got to see the exhibit as it was coming from an empty room to become this really amazing display of technology and earth and relationship and then all the different little bumps along the way. So that was, it's really exciting to watch that because as I'm a literary person, meaning I work with writing and I tend to see art on the back end, meaning when it's finished and it's published. And other than the fact that I'm a writer myself, I don't really get to see the semblance of much art. So that was a pleasure to see all of that and to watch Julie's process as well, assembling the pieces itself. My work is, like I said, within story. So while I'm very engaged and interested in plants, most of my work is done with advocacy and writing about plants. So I can't really tell you, watch out for this project that I'm working on, because I'm usually in court as an expert witness advocating for our earth and our water against Manitoba Hydro, against TransCanada, against, I've appeared in court so many times now that I see the same lawyers over and over and over again. So, and they all I just know the questions they're about to ask. And so that's the kind of work that I do. But one of the works that I do in terms of advocating for our knowledge is to advocate for ourselves as scientists. So my position is that Indigenous peoples are not the people you see in bookstores where we're in the children's literature section. We are intellectuals and scientists before we were anything else. And what I tell my students is that you have to understand the world before you can speak about it. And for millennia, from the very beginning, in fact, our very first creation story as Anishinaabe is a story about experimentation. It's a story about science. It's a story about physics. It's a story about astronomy. Every single part within our story is about science. And so looking at our stories in which, when they're offered, are particularly at our Atazukanic, our creation stories, these are stories innately about the biology and ecology of the universe. They are about explaining how the universe operates. And while it may seem like it's often framed into children's stories, these are stories that can tell you everything you need to know about relationships in the ecological world. And they use terms like speech and breath and motion. All the terms that they use in science, they just didn't have white coats on when they did it. And that is the only fundamental difference. So one of the things that my most recent project right now is studying the notion of roots. And which was very exciting because I got to spend time with Indigenous plants in two different projects that Julie and I were involved in. One was this project where we're going to speak a little bit about what's in the exhibit itself. But we also, Julie and I were kind of, I was more the political advocacy side. She was the art curation side of the installation of Niimama at the Forks. And so has anyone seen the installation of Niimama? You can see it right as you St. Mary's and St. Mary's meets Main Street, turn on the left-hand side. We used to be called the South Point, which is now called Niigaan, which is two rivers. That site is Niigaan, and so Julie and I were really the ones in charge of, with 3 other artists, getting that installation in. But one of the things that we did was ensure we did an investigation of the plants on the South Point. And what we discovered was about 95% of the plants at the Forks are foreign plants, meaning they've been introduced from other places of the world. And one of our projects is to re-indigenize the South Point, to the point where we were at the opening ceremony and we ran out of sage to smudge the 150 or so people that showed up. And so we literally reached down on the ground and grabbed the sage from the ones that we had planted and then put that in the smudge bowl. It was a really awesome moment for us. And so that's what we're trying to do. But one of the things that, and I think I'll speak about this afterwards, would the HDMI cord work if I showed a short video? I'm looking at the tech guy at the back there. If I plug into the HDMI over there, not right now, but for the next section, it would work? Okay. So I have a short video I'm going to show about the power of plants and how plants also give us a metaphor for understanding not just indigenization, but also colonization. We often think of plants as these altruistic, perfect things, but they also colonize. And so it is a lesson for us to understand how to indigenize spaces as well. And so all of those things are within story. And all of those things are within stories that I've heard from very young, being 4 or 5 years old, sitting in the Medewin Lodge with medicine pickers all surrounded around me, having gone picking myself, but also being exposed to people like my sister, who is an incredible medicine carrier and teaches me regularly on the power of those medicines, and also people, new sisters like Julie, who are so generous and kind to be able to let me be a part of an exhibition like this. I think it is our job, and what this exhibit asks us to do, is to do our own work with medicines and to collect those medicines around us, to collect not just the medicines that we see in the earth, but also within the stories. And so that's what I wrote the essay in here about, where I don't want to read much of it, but I want to just say that on page, where is it? Right there. Right here. On page 14, I say that Nagam calls for us to collect an understanding of the medicines around us. This knowledge, like our relations, is and are still here. This is inherently a question of how we perceive of land as something to buy and trade, or something that sustains and grow with us. Gaining a competency and fluency of medicines necessarily involves spending time on the earth, studying, experimenting, and offering your time in relationship to it. It takes time to understand why colors, directions, and roots grow in the patterns they do. Once we spend enough time thinking and studying it, then it is our job to share our findings with others. Nagam asks us to do all of this when watching the medicines appear and disappear, and in these spaces, think of who else can teach us about them, whether it be a kukum, the bears, the birds, the air, and or the rain. And so this exhibit, I think, is very exciting because it leaves us the space, like good stories do, to then now do the work on our own. It shows us, and then as the plants disappear, it leaves us to do the work now. And who is it that we can share that with? Who else can we learn from? Who else can we engage and involve this process? And that's one of the things I find most exciting in this work. So that's all the other things. And then, the last thing I'd say is I'm a columnist with the Free Press. And so you can catch me on any hate messenger boards. Usually they're talking about that guy or whatever. But that's my other project, I guess, if I were to share that. So go ahead. Let me get you.
Thank you. So I think that's a nice segue to come back to Julie and ask you about your process, because I think Niigaan's right. The plants appear and they disappear, so they regenerate, they grow, they die, and this is a cycle. Can you tell us about how you put this together, what you were thinking of, why you used animation? A little bit about how you came to it, and I have some images that I can put up here too.
I think I'll start is thinking about the concept. So I had done a larger work, actually, which we don't, I think, have pictures of, but it's a large scale installation. It's 10 feet by 16 feet in length and 10 feet in height, and there's 2 huge panels like that. And those panels are birch trees that are kind of like cut off. They're just like silhouettes almost. And in that work, I had drawn massive image and then digitally transferred that image, which then became an animation. On the same, I had 3 kind of creatures. I had a whippoorwill, which is from just here. He only lives here in Manitoba. He doesn't go anywhere else. And it's got such a beautiful sound. And the whippoorwill is actually in the work. You can hear it when you go into the gallery space. The other one is a blue dragonfly, which also just likes to live here. So it was very like Manitoba based. And then the third animal was, well, we call them like they're prairie wolves, but they're coyotes, and we see them everywhere here on the prairies. And they like to roam, they go where they want to go and they do what they want to do. So I was thinking a lot about, so I had installed that at the Smithsonian in New York, and then I had another exhibition in Toronto, and they were really interested in me showing that work. And so because I had a solo show and I had this huge gallery space, I thought about what kind of work would be in relationship with that. And so I had created 4 paintings that were actually based off of some of the images that I had taken in where Carl is at the Brokenhead Trail. And I had made them kind of watercolors, but I wanted, what's the word when it's like the, how the creatures under the sea kind of become phosphorescent?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I wanted the images to be kind of phosphorescent, and so I actually used some kind of painting and kind of blue lit it so that it would get this sense of that you were kind of under in this kind of magical space. And so when I had made that work, because I wanted it to be able to have a nice conversation with the projection-based work, and so that larger work was like painting with light. And so once I had finished that work, I thought, man, I would really, really like to animate these paintings that I had did. And so I started to think about what it would be like, what would it look like, how would I do that? And at first when I spoke to, and the one thing we didn't do is I want to thank Gallery C103 and Jennifer Gibson for all her hard work in terms of being a curator and working with me on a new work, and obviously all the funders who helped make that happen. But I just so when I originally spoke to Jennifer, I had sort of imagined a built environment, and we were going to create kind of a built space that would house monitors, TVs, basically, to be able to show the work. And then when I thought about it, I just really didn't love the idea of the work being on a monitor or a screen that way. And so then I was thinking about what did I like about the kind of creating that work and making it kind of illuminate and have this kind of magical feeling. And so I wanted to kind of recreate that magic. And so I thought a little bit about this idea that I was going to make this light box, and in the light box you would be able to see this kind of image move and kind of appear and disappear, but you would not understand or know how I was actually doing that. So the idea was to kind of, not trick you, but like allow you to have the kind of space to think about or imagine how it was operating in there. And so, or to think about what was behind the scenes. And lots of times when we see projection work, we see the projector, we know where it's projecting, we can walk in front of it, you have a much more physical presence with it. But I wanted to kind of remove that, kind of hide all of the background. And then I wanted to create something that was kind of delicate. And so I was thinking a lot about the different plants that stood out. And at first I was actually going to do the lady slippers, because there's so many beautiful orchids in that space where Carl is. And then I was like, I don't know if I want to do the lady slippers. I don't know if I want the work to be just aesthetically pleasing. So I was thinking more about what is it that I like which plants that I was the most interested in. And so I lean on the province or its general area of what we have to offer. So I thought, well, blueberries are my favorite, so they made it into the list. And I pick them every year, and I go out with my family, and it's kind of a really fun event for me, and it's grounding, but it also reminds me that I love my family. in that kind of, good way. And it's kind of a nice feeling. And so I was thinking a lot about it. But then I also think about what blueberries have to offer us. They are really healthy for us. They can, prevent lots of different things in terms of the antioxidants that they produce. And so, so I thought, okay, yeah, blueberries. And then one of my other favorite plants is a fireweed. And mostly because it's linked to women, it's very strong. It's one of the first thing that grows back once a fire happens. So like if a fire happens in an area, fireweed is one of the first kind of plants that comes back up through the ground, and that's partly because their roots are so deep that they're not affected, the same way that some other plants on the surface that don't have the deep roots. And so they kind of come back up, and the fireweed, same thing, you can make teas, ointments. It's good, I think, for digestive. There's a whole host of kind of like really strong aspects that it has. And then, I also then selected tobacco root, bearberry, and Labrador tea, which I just love. So, these are sort of things that, and we actually picked some Labrador tea last time that I was with Carl, and that was a lot of fun. But I was also thinking about the tactility of each plant too. So I was conscious of which ones I was picking, but also aesthetically, how they would look beside each other. That's always a conscious decision. So how the process actually works is that each image that you see, if we go back, yeah, and then we can flip back to this one right away. So each image is hand-drawn and then painted, and I just did watercolor and pencil. And then from that, if you want to flip to the next one, it's photographed. And so the painting's photographed, and then it then becomes a digital image. And then I reproduce the digital image, and I painstakingly paint out every single little section of that plant to make it growing and decaying. So then you take about 200 images on that little guy on the right, and you basically then move those images into an animation program, and then you can have them moving up and moving back down. But you could create that through just the animation program if you didn't want to actually draw and paint, but you'd never get the same sort of delicate kind of tactile feeling by just recreating that work. So you actually have to spend the time, and for me, I really liked that idea of, I like making things. So in the end, there's that kind of like attachment that comes to that. Plus there's kind of a closeness of when you all of a sudden recreate a plant or a thing to kind of, be something. And so I wanted people to be able to come into the gallery space and feel immersed. So to almost, I don't want you to close your eyes, but you could close your eyes for a little bit, and you could hear the sound and feel immersed as if you were in nature. And so this idea is that you would, you'd sense all the senses. And I actually had lots of people come up to me and said, "Did you put earth in the boxes? Because I smell earth." Wow. And I was like, "No." And I actually didn't. And in some projects, I have actually used, cedar or other kinds of kind of medicinal plants that smell in order to like invoke that feeling. But this time I had not. I did not put anything to. One, I didn't want to like even take any risk with the projectors, and two, I hadn't even thought of that, which is a great idea, but I didn't do it. But I love the idea that kind of fixed environment that I created actually gave people the sensation that they were actually thinking that they were outside and smelling earth. So that to me was exciting. The other thing I would say is that I really wanted the growth and the decay and the kind of movement to remind us that they are living, breathing entities, that they are people, and they're important. And so I also kind of intentionally picked small plants that kind of lay low to the ground, with the exception of like the fireweed can actually get a little bit tall. But the idea would be that, we walk over those plants all the time, totally unaware of what they actually have to offer us. And so if we think about the kind of environmental chaos that we're in right now in terms of, all the issues that we're facing as humanity, if we actually just stopped and listened and talked to the plants, or talk to elders that, work with the plants, that can actually translate what the plants are saying. And if we look to that kind of knowledge, we could actually heal and have hope for the future. And so that was sort of my mindset behind some of the work. Did I answer everything?
Yeah, you did.
Okay. Okay.
So that makes me think of a few different things. One is that what if we changed our mindset to this idea that nature is vital? I think that changes everything in a really fundamental way. So I might throw that out to you. But I wanted to ask you, Carl, because Julie has so much knowledge now about each of these plants, the 5 that she used, and some of it she got from you. And when I've gone through Brokenhead, sometimes with older women, and Carl is telling us about all the medicinal properties of the plants, many of these older women, often settler women, will say, oh, I did this with my mom. My mom used to take me to the forests and the fields, and we would pick chamomile, or we'd pick this and that. And I think it's generational even for us in the West. Actually, people did have that knowledge. Our moms and grandmothers had it, and it's been lost recently. Diane Whitehouse said, when I grew up, there wasn't a pharmacy on every corner. So if you needed something, you went to the field and you got it. So I want to ask you, Carl, how could people benefit by relearning all this knowledge that you have about what's available outside in the fields?
Once you start working within the plants and stuff, and you start getting that connections, spiritual stuff, it's a spiritual connections, mostly for First Nations when they start working with plants, that you got to get the feel of the plant, I guess you could say. Like your mindset you got to ask the creator, I need the strength to take this plant and use it for sickness or to help someone up, feel better and stuff. But it's that connection that you have to go through, and it makes you feel better. And then if you could somehow find a way that everybody has that connection and respect the land, respect the plants, and especially the water. Because if you don't have the water, the plants ain't there. And the way the water situation is going now all over the world, it's kind of important that we look at that. And being an interpretive guide on a trail, and we get a lot of students, especially grade school students, and I stress lots about the water with them and the plants. This is our future we're talking about here, and not to make them think too hard because they're still young and minds are still growing, but the future is right here, right now. And if we don't take care of this water-based, because water is disappearing fast, and if we don't have it, then we don't have our plants, we don't have our trees. And you look at the plants, like they die every year. Trees live for hundreds of years. So there's a cycle in every plant. Like one tree you could use, especially if it's balsam fir, you could use that tree for years, taking sap and stuff from it and healing yourself with what it's used for. Mostly it's in digestion and healing wounds and stuff. So you could use one tree for the longest time without actually killing it. But a lot of times people just get carried away and just take too much, and then you got to move on to another place, but you're depleting all your resources. And that's what we're trying to teach our youth in our communities, and plus the youth that come out to our trail, is that we can't deplete everything. We got to save something, because 100 years from now, who knows what's going to happen. Like we're sitting here today, like, yeah, okay, fine, but you look at 100 years, what's going to be here? Industrial age, like, really took a lot out of our people. Like, I can remember when I was a kid growing up with my grandparents in the bush, and then going to day school and forgetting all that and coming back to it. It was very hard to get back, and I'm still learning yet. So, but like I said, I hang out with elders and I learn from them and listen to them. I finally listened, because I remember listening as a kid, but not for the longest time after leaving and going to school and stuff. But now I understand it, and I hope that I could teach the kids to understand it too. And like I say, it's very important to have the water and very important to have our plants, because if we don't have that, then we're nothing really. Thank you.
Thank you. Niigaan, can I go to you? Because one thing I read in your catalog for Julie was what happened in terms of decolonization, in terms of the Indigenous medical knowledge. So the Western system completely separated that and broke that, and I had never thought of that. So placing that sort of pharmaceutical system in our society really separated people from that plant knowledge.
Yeah, so, okay, so, okay, I'll try to get to this other stuff later, but I'll answer that question first. So one thing that really struck me And this was when my daughter was born. Her mother is Lorena Fontaine, who works here. And when we were about to, she was about to give birth, but I was there. And so we wanted to have her at home. And we wanted to have her on her reserve, and on her family's reserve. And so we went to Chief and Council, and they said, "Oh no, we can't do that." And then we went to the local hospital, and they said, "No, you don't have the infrastructure. That's not safe. You can't." And they said, "You have to have a baby in the hospital. That's it." And we were like, well, that doesn't seem right. Like, how did babies get born before the hospitals and before white people? And so we started doing research on that, and it took us months and months working with two different midwives and two Indigenous midwives, and we learned all about these birthing practices that were predominantly women-centered, like medicines, that had been done for hundreds and hundreds of years, predominantly led by grandmothers who were the birth carriers of knowledge in the community. There were also people who birthing would be as long as the baby was growing. You'd be collecting medicines for all those 9 months. You'd be preparing the earth. You'd be preparing the fire. Everybody had a role within that birth. It wasn't just grandmothers and women. It was also all of the men who were there to surround the home, to build safety and security within that area, and to also prepare fire and to prepare food, and also to pick up some of the work that the grandmothers were needed to have done at that time. And so there was an entire system that was all outlawed when birthing was outlawed, and it involved directly the use of medicines. So Western science has been on a massive war against Indigenous science virtually since day one, when Jacques Cartier showed up and wanted gold and spices, and they offered him birch tea. And he said, "Oh no, I don't want that." And they said, "Hey, you look a little scurvied up. You should probably drink this." You want to know what riches are? You want to know what the real riches are? It's of the earth. That's where the riches are. We keep seeking this imaginary riches. We now call it oil and shale gas, but the real riches are within the earth itself. It's with what saved Cartier's life, which was the medicines of the earth itself. That birch tea literally saved his life. And so this artificial desires, which have led inevitably to conquest, profit, capitalism, neoliberalism, all of these things have been inevitably threatened by Indigenous knowledge, and particularly Indigenous medicines, because these are things that are inherently sustainable within the earth. Everyone has access to. We call that thing socialism or communism now, those kinds of ideas. And we put a big red X across them, literally, and put them under threat because they can't be commodified and patented. And then when the companies run out of ideas, who do they turn to? Who do they patent the knowledge of? When Uncle Ben's ran out of notions for what kind of rice to produce in the next packaging, who did they go to? They went to people at White Earth, and then they commodified wild rice. That's why you see all wild rice on the shelves. That's all stolen from Indigenous peoples. Medicine's the same thing. Bayer. There's been attempts to commodify and, of course, patent tobacco. All of that's been gained from our knowledge, from our peoples. And those, after you outlaw it, then you steal it. And that is the exact recipe for colonialism. The recipe for colonialism is that once you see something as a threat, you identify it, and then you turn it on the people themselves. And that's I don't mean to get all dark and everything, but this is exactly the kind of thing that I go in the courts and I fight all the time, because one of the ways in which assessment processes, for example, involve. Julie talked about the work in New Zealand. They actually don't have life. They're seen as having an advocate. That's what they have. They don't really have life. You get to have an advocate in the room for the river. But in any consultation process involving us, for example, we will say that you have to consult the caribou when you build that kiosk generating station up north. And they go, how do you do that? And we go, well, we can tell you a story. And they go, no, we're just talking about the people. So they'll identify the 3 First Nations. They need to, never mind the 65 others that are all impacted by that dam, but they only go to the immediate area. Never mind all of the other life that live within that area that need to be consulted. But there's no laws for that. There's the only law that we have is Section 35, which is considered an empty box that we have to keep advocating for, fighting for every inch. And we do that by fighting for our plant relatives. I want to show you what plants that are introduced that are predominantly for decorative purposes, predominantly from other areas of the world, look like, and the kind of investment that they have within the soil themselves. Those are the ones on the left, and the ones on the right are indigenous plants. These are plants that have deep relationships, ecological balance, networks, exchanges with other plants in areas. And if we just look on the prairie alone, here is the plant network of indigenous plants within our community. And this is why these plants they don't just tell us about relationships within space, but they also are symptoms. They can tell us about dangers. They can tell us about relationships and what vitamins would live within the soil themselves. They can tell us about history and things that have happened throughout time. They can tell us all about what the network of other plants that are happening under the earth itself. I don't want to take away from your BI, because I know what you're going to say when you talk about BI, so biological intelligence. But I have a short video which would be a good segue for you. Do you want me to do it now, or do you want? Yeah. Okay. So I don't want to steal your thunder, though. I wanted to show you about the power of vegetation. This is a shorter vision. This is actually done by Canadian researchers, but this is the BBC who are studying it. All you have to do is spend a little bit of time with our Advocacy. Our Advocacy, which are often, as I said before, classified as children's stories, simplistic stories, which are the most sacred, intellectual, ecological stories that have ever existed in this territory. They are the most scientific explanations for how life operates within this space. You'd often hear stories like, when a Boju spoke with the tree. And I'm not talking about like Pocahontas speak with the tree. I'm talking about sharing tobacco with the tree, sharing relationship with the tree, sharing relationships which involve digging up roots, sharing medicine with the tree. Like, they couldn't figure out how bears hibernated. And scientists are still like, we can't quite figure that out. Anishinaabe knew this forever. They wake up, they look for bear root medicine, they take it, and then they go back and they feed off their own urine. That's exactly, and we have stories about this, which we've told for millennia. We are scientists way before we are storytellers. And this is the kind of knowledge that we have been carrying for a very long period of time. And one of the most important things is that it takes a long period of time to get to know this place. But when you do get to know this place, you can share innate knowledge with everyone else that comes afterwards. And you might even save their life. Jacques Cartier. And that's all I really wanted to say about the power of roots. This is the kind of stories that I talk about with roots, and I'm working on an essay right now about that. So, but it is a metaphor too for colonization and globalization. I think we're going to get into a little bit later. Yeah. So I'll leave that for my colleagues after this. So
this is a great segue for you. And can you maybe tell us why Western scientists have struggled with some of these ideas, or the mother tree we're just talking about now? Can you historicize that a bit for us?
Well, first, I want to say that one of the scientists I mentioned before who did some of the research about tree networks specifically says that Indigenous peoples of North America, thank you, knew about the importance of these mother trees, that there are these old, very well-established trees in a forest that contributed to this network and shared all the nutrients, carbon, nitrogen, and so forth, and that these trees were incredibly important to the health of the entire network. So this was knowledge that she credits, and it's something that she investigated and was inspired by. Yes, sorry, can you repeat the question?
No,
yeah.
I guess since you're a historian, can you tell us a little bit about what has been the problem with Western scientists accepting some of these ideas, or have they waxed and waned, or, you mentioned pushback before. Like, I know there is a history of these things in the West blurbering up but being repressed again.
Right. So there are all these undercurrents of vitalism, of thinking about the plant in this sort of complex, holistic way, of developing theories about tree consciousness and plant consciousness. And they've been underground and not always, the sort of theory that the entire community is subscribed to. Some of this knowledge was stolen from Indigenous people historically. Some of it was appropriated in various ways. And the more modern paradigm of looking at plants in a mechanistic way seems to have been ascendant for a while, but as I mentioned, there seem to be these ideas that come back again and again that may change that. So I want to sort of give another quote from one of the scientists I mentioned, who says that all living organisms viewed within this context, this complex, holistic context, become agents endowed with autonomy rather than objects in a mechanistically conceived world. These viewpoints, combined with recent evidence, may contribute to move the entire scientific field toward an integrated study of cognitive biology. So this is where this paradigm shift that they are arguing for seems to clash with these ideas of simplistic, sort of mechanistic, reductionist way of looking at plants.
And I think that's where Delia and our research overlaps, is that we both look historically at essentially environmentalist attitudes in the West that are suppressed by orthodox science or just by capitalism. So they come up to the surface and then they're pressed down again, but they do have a long history, actually. They just struggle to stay around. Although maybe it is a paradigm shift now that we can all accept. So I think one of the last questions was, and it's the heavy question, is, what has globalization and colonization done to our relationship with the earth? And I guess, is there an optimistic future here?
I hope so. I would say, well, for me, those of you that know me, I am mostly almost all sunshine and optimism, so I'm going to say yes. I am hopeful that there is a positive or kind of a way out of the kind of like binaries or conundrums that we find ourselves constantly stuck in. At the same time, I also just think, for my own children, I don't want them to have to be doing the same work that I'm doing, and I definitely know that my parents and my grandparents and them before them didn't want me to have to do that work either. And so I think a little bit about, for me, Niigaan, you had wrote something funny in the essay where you said, she literally put like the nature in a box, so it couldn't actually, be more symbolic in terms of colonization or like being in lockdown. And so when I think a little bit about the work and the project, I want each person that witnesses that work to think about the kind of power that's in those plants and the kind of unraveling that we could start to see happen if we actually started to put some of that knowledge forward. And so you can call that decolonization, or you can talk about, self-determination, in terms of like those little entities becoming what they need or getting the space that they need to have to kind of breathe and be part of the ecosystems that they currently are in. And I think that that's kind of an important metaphor. And I think we're going to talk a little bit more about it too, is that, just because it's a plant doesn't necessarily make it that it's trying to decolonize. One of the main plants that I actually do the sugar bush from, which is the Manitoba maple, is actually one of the most aggressive trees. And it actually, is one of the ones that actually colonizes other trees and takes out root systems so it can continue to see itself flourish and grow. At the same time, I don't know who doesn't like maple syrup, so I definitely, that's the trees that I tap in terms to get maple syrup. So there's these kind of like layers of conundrums, and even from the video that Niigaan showed, that there's these layers there that happen, that it's not a kind of all plants are good, all plants are bad, just the same thing in terms of how we think about our society. We're healing, we're moving forward, we're complicated, we're still in a stage of colonization, we're also in a stage of indigenization, decolonization, self-determination, and for me, there's lots of hope in that. And so when I think a little bit about, the topics that we're talking about, the idea of, how so many plants got brought to different places and they're invasive species, and then they start killing out other plants, and then animals start thriving that probably shouldn't be thriving. And so there's this whole kind of complex ecosystem that you try and change one thing, or what's also common here is you get rid of one plant, but then a whole bunch of other things start to suffer. And so this kind of ripple effect, and we see that happening within our own humanity. When one person has an action or another person has a reaction, we automatically see this ripple effect, and then so many people are affected in ways that we can't actually undo, and we actually have to figure out better ways of working together. So just like ecosystems, people have to also come to an awareness and an understanding and be able to communicate just the same way that plants and animals do. We have to think about, how are we going to be conscious? What kind of person do we want to be? What kind of interactions do we want? And when I think about, something like the artwork, for me, I want you to sit with it for a little bit. I want you to think about, how these entities affect you, or does it cause you to want to go back outside and go and enjoy some of that space? And so if I can even just convert a few people who want to go out and to be into nature or are reminded of the power of that. And even just hearing Diane Whitehouse saying something like that, who's one of our most senior and established artists here in Winnipeg, she, just that invoked that memory and feeling for her, I think is really, really important to be kind of reminded of those opportunities and see that as a potential for hope.
Relearn that knowledge that we've all forgotten.
Yeah.
So yeah, either of you.
Well, if Julie's the shiny, optimistic, I will be something else. I'm the darkness. No. Well, I think you pretty much know how I feel. You just have to read my column to figure out that I don't feel a lot of optimism at the moment, because I see an aggressive resource agenda with a hell-bent federal government that really doesn't matter if it's conservative or liberals. It's the exact same policy when it comes to Indigenous people and paternalism, so on and so forth. And we only had to look at last week, and as we were having the opening, there were people arrested for standing on their own traditional territory. And so over expressions of concern involving pipelines or economic resource or extraction projects or whatever. But here's where the hope that I find. The hope that I find is actually, I think, is epitomized within the exhibit. I do say Nagam literally boxes nature, but then I think the most interesting thing about indigeneity that I've ever found is this irony, right, and contradiction and complexity, because that's the thing that I think that we offer the best in the world, and one of the things that we offer is that regardless of all of the things that happen to us, we persevere, we escape, we resist, we endure, we thrive, and that's what this exhibit does. Like you put nature in a box, but yet then it escapes. It literally disappears before your eye. You put it on a white sheet that is a thin veneer of technology between the viewer and technology, and that all disappears and dissipates as the nature escapes it. I think that's so beautiful. And then the sound and the images invite us to think in our minds of our relationships with our cookums and with our relatives, and with when we were young and we were picking Saskatoon berries on the side of a road. Like it takes us to all of those places, and that's why I think it's so exciting, because what defeats colonialism is dreaming, is visioning, is refusing to give up being who you are. It is continuing to endure that relationship no matter the obstacles in front of you. That relationship with your uncle, or that relationship with the bears, or the relationship with the water. It's to commit to that relationship in its fullest form, and don't let anything get in its way. And while neoliberalism and pollution and Donald Trump can get in your way, no matter how many walls that guy builds, he can't build the wall between you. He can't make you sit behind a wall. You can do the work to get over that wall, to get under it, to get through it. You can do that work. And so I didn't mean to bring Donald Trump, and that traumatized everybody, I'm sure, into your art talk. But that is, for me, the ultimate statement of hope. And this exhibit has it. I mean, we're in a university where this university is far more progressive than others that I might know well. But this university still struggles with recognizing Indigenous knowledge. It still has difficulty. I mean, it's ironic that we have this statement on nature in a highly industrialized space in downtown Winnipeg. All of that irony is here, but yet the exhibit invites us to escape it, and I think that's exciting. That's hopeful.
And well, Delia, do you think that there's a sense of reciprocity with science and Indigenous knowledge in this new biological paradigm that you're telling us about?
There seems to be. The actors themselves, the scientists themselves acknowledge that. Yeah, perhaps there is hope in there. I mean, science is, it changes. It's in constant flux and conversations. And so I think that there is the fact that we see this language of relationships more commonly among some of these scientists, I think is a hopeful part of that hopeful aspect.
And Carl, I know you must be hopeful because you teach kids and you bring 3,000 people out to your interpretive trail. Do you feel that they are taking your lessons and they understand the stewardship of the land when they are there with you, some of them anyway?
Yeah, we had the Winnipeg School Division, it's called Aboriginal Leadership Program. 180 kids signed up for it. And they came over 3 days to the wetlands. We did our thing. We had the Western scientific theme, and then we had the Aboriginal theme, and we just had an open theme. So when we got the feedback from all the students, like a lot of them weren't in the bush for, never left the city, I guess. When they went to the wetlands and walked around and we told them to take a picture and write something about the picture, what they thought about the area. And the feedback was really, really amazing. I couldn't believe how much they thought about the land, and how much they thought about what we told them about how plants regenerate, how plants help you, how water's this and water's that. That was a really good feedback, and I hope most of the students that do come get the same kind of, get the knowledge of the land, the teaching that we give, and hopefully they carry on.
So I'm just gonna jump in and just say I want to thank Serena Keshavjee for all her amazing work and doing such nice introductions and having a real prepped chair here. And we're gonna close because I know some of you guys you have to get going to your next classes and such. But we're gonna stick around if you guys want to ask us a few questions. We're definitely open to that. And again, I want to thank Jennifer and the Gallery C103 and all of my amazing colleagues and friends and panelists here. So thank you so much for coming. Miigwech, Marcy.